Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker. A story that smells worse than history class ever warned you. Forget kings and philosophers. This is the world built by the people knee-deep in things you'd rather not name. The ones who washed clothes in pee, tanned hides in dung, and handled the dead with bare hands so everyone else could pretend to be civilized. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe put on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in ancient Rome. The good news, civilization exists. The bad news, sanitation doesn't. You're a fuller, which is a nice way of saying professional urine enthusiast. Your job is to wash togas using nothing but human pee, gallons of it, collected from public pots placed around the city. You can thank Emperor Vespasian for that delightful system. He even taxed the stuff, inventing the world's first pee tax. The street you're standing on is slick with runoff, the air thick with the scent of sour ammonia. You can feel it in your sinuses, in your soul. Every step squelches. The vat in front of you bubbles faintly in the sun. You climb in, barefoot, and start stomping, rhythmically mashing the white wool cloth with your feet like some nightmarish grape crusher. Except instead of producing wine, you're producing the illusion of cleanliness. Romans adored bright togas, the ancient equivalent of wearing an expensive suit to brunch. What they didn't adore was the reality of how those togas got that white. It's all thanks to people like you, who inhaled ammonia fumes for hours and went home smelling like the world's worst science experiment. If you're lucky, you'll get paid in enough coins to buy lunch. If not, you might just go home with a permanent cough and the faint respect of no one. And yet, without you, Rome would reek of unwashed linen and failed vanity. You, the fuller, were the unsung hero of Roman hygiene. Civilization, it turns out, was held together by buckets. Fast forward several centuries and trade your vat of urine for something even worse, a pit of rot. You're now a tanner, somewhere in medieval Europe, standing knee-deep in animal hides, dung and despair. Leather was everything. Armour, shoes, saddles, book covers, and getting it meant soaking skins in vats of lime and feces to loosen the hair before scraping them clean by hand. You might think your nose will eventually adjust to the smell. It won't. Towns built tanneries downstream for a reason. By the 14th century, they were officially classified as nuisance industries, which is medieval code for please stay far, far away. Still, leather was wealth. Kings needed it. Soldiers relied on it. Monks wrote on it. And you. You just kept scraping, gagging, and wondering why God gave you both a sense of smell and bills to pay. If you somehow survive that career path, history has another treat waiting for you. Welcome to ancient Egypt, where your new job involves preparing corpses for eternity. The embalming room is quiet, except for the sound of your own heartbeat and the gentle crackle of resin being heated over flame. The air is sharp with natron salt, resin and decay. Mummification wasn't just work, it was divine craftsmanship. You carefully remove organs, pack the body with aromatic spices and sawdust, and wrap it in linen for the long journey to the afterlife. Egyptians believed preserving the body preserved the soul's identity, which meant your grim handiwork determined whether someone reached paradise or got lost forever. You'd think that would earn you some respect, but no. Society saw you as impure, spiritually radioactive. You couldn't even sit with normal people at dinner. You were essential, sacred, and somehow disgusting all at once. Humanity's favourite contradiction. Now the smell of natron fades, and suddenly you're ankle deep in mud. It's the 18th century and you're a leech collector. The pay? Barely enough. The process? You walk into a swamp, let leeches latch onto your legs and wait. Each one fills with blood, your blood, before you pluck it off and drop it into a jar for doctors who think bleeding cures everything from fever to melancholy. You feel dizzy, but hey, science marches on. At least someone's getting rich. Spoiler, not you. It's easy to laugh now, safely tucked under your clean sheets, far from any vat or corpse or swamp. But the truth is, these jobs built the world. The farmers fed it, sure, but it was the tanners, the embalmers, the cleaners, and the collectors who made civilization smell slightly less unbearable. Every shining monument in history had someone behind it holding their breath and doing the work no one else wanted. And as the imagined stench of ammonia, rot, and ancient resin lingers in your mind, you start to realize something profound. The foundations of civilization weren't clean. They were filthy, exhausting, and thankless. Humanity advanced because someone had to scrub, soak, and scrape their way through the worst of it. Now drift deeper into that thought, because if you think those jobs were bad, wait until you see what happened when civilization decided to deal with its waste on an even larger scale. Up ahead, beyond the stinking tanneries and bubbling vats, lies a profession that handled the very essence of decay, and sometimes became part of it. You've survived the vats of Roman urine and the dung pits of medieval tanneries, but now it's time to meet the ancient workers who handled a problem even empires couldn't ignore. Garbage. Not treasure, not glory, just the mountain of waste that every civilization quietly tried to pretend didn't exist. You're about to step into the sandals of the people who cleaned up after humanity, long before brooms had handles and sanitation had science. Welcome to the original waste management industry, where every sunrise brought a new and fragrant crisis. Picture yourself walking through the streets of ancient Athens around 400 BCE. The marble temples gleam under the sun, philosophers argue about ethics, and in the alley behind them, you're ankle deep in spoiled fish guts and broken pottery. The word for garbage collector didn't exist yet, but that's your job. Part scavenger, part civic saviour. There were no bins, no organised routes, and no uniforms. You were just one of the many poor souls who roam the streets with baskets, hauling away whatever the citizens of democracy decided to discard that day. And it wasn't just food scraps. Ancient Athenians used broken pottery shards called ostraka as both dishware and voting ballots. When a pot cracked, or a politician fell out of favour, it went straight into the trash heap. Archaeologists today have found literal piles of these shards buried beneath the city, many still bearing scratched names of exiled citizens. Your ancient garbage route was, without exaggeration, democracy's recycling program. The cleaner you kept the streets, the safer everyone was from plague. But, as with all early sanitation, no one thanked you. If you didn't exist, Athens would have smelled like philosophy and decay. Move forward a few centuries, and the Roman Empire takes the idea of filth to a professional level. Rome had over 1 million residents at its peak, all producing roughly half a ton of waste per person annually. The Cloaca Maxima, Latin for Great Sewer, was the engineering miracle that kept the city alive. It drained runoff, waste and stormwater directly into the Tiber River. But someone had to maintain it. That someone was you. Congratulations, you're now an ancient Roman sewer cleaner. Armed with a torch and what historians call a disturbing amount of courage, you'd crawl through stone tunnels knee-deep in sludge, scraping out blockages of human waste, animal carcasses, and occasionally entire amphorae that had been thrown down the drains by lazy shopkeepers. Ancient texts describe these men as foricari or cloacinae operari, workers of the sewer goddess Cloacina, who was worshipped for keeping the city's drains from erupting. Yes, Rome actually had a goddess of the sewer. If that doesn't tell you how important this job was, nothing will. The smell was indescribable. The air inside was so thick with methane that one spark could set an entire section ablaze. There are Roman accounts of explosions occurring when sewer workers brought torches too close to trapped gas pockets. You'd hear the sound of rushing water, feel the tremble of the city above you, and pray you didn't end your shift as a cautionary tale. Still, this job was so vital that some workers were granted state protection. Without you, Rome would have drowned in its own prosperity. Meanwhile, across the world in ancient China, sanitation took on a more practical and profitable twist. During the Han Dynasty, Cities developed organised waste collection systems, but the real money was in the human waste itself. Farmers prized it as fertiliser, and entire professions formed around gathering and selling night soil. You'd carry buckets of it through the streets at dawn, balancing them on a bamboo pole, sloshing with each step. In the hierarchy of labour, it was about as low as you could get, but it kept the rice fields fertile and the cities from flooding with filth. There's even evidence that some collection routes were inherited across generations, a family business of the least glamorous kind. Japanese cities in later centuries followed the same logic, even creating waste markets where human excrement could be traded by volume. Wealthier neighbourhoods sold their waste for higher prices because apparently rich diets made for premium compost. Imagine explaining that to your boss. "Sorry I'm late, the merchants from uptown had better stock today." It was gross, yes, but economically brilliant. Humanity has never been great at hygiene, but we've always been surprisingly efficient when there's profit in it. You pause for a moment, trying to imagine what these streets must have looked like. Narrow lanes filled with smoke, livestock and shouting merchants, all layered with the constant stench of decay. In medieval Europe, garbage collection took a nosedive. Cities like Paris and London grew faster than anyone could clean them. Trash was simply tossed into the street, where pigs and dogs did the rest. There's a record from the 14th century London describing the gutters as flooded with refuse, so that one may not pass unsoiled. The only people brave enough to confront it were the rakers, workers who scraped the filth from the roads and hauled it outside the city walls. Rakers often worked at night to avoid the worst of the crowds, pushing carts through alleys lit by flickering torches, the sound of wheels grinding over cobblestones mixed with the splash of muck. Their job was essential to keeping disease at bay, yet they were treated as outcasts. Some earned side income by scavenging anything remotely valuable: bits of metal, broken utensils, discarded clothing. Historians have found that rakers were often fined if they were caught stealing, which raises the question of who exactly wanted to enforce morality at midnight in a medieval sewer. By the Renaissance, sanitation was still considered a lower-class burden. In Florence, the city hired cleaning guilds to sweep marketplaces and wash the stone courtyards. Their pay was meagre, their uniforms non-existent, and their risk constant. They waded through waste teeming with bacteria centuries before anyone knew what bacteria was. You can almost picture them, dragging buckets through marble streets, unknowingly fighting an invisible enemy that would later be named cholera. Even ancient religious systems got involved in the sanitation struggle. In Hindu communities, cleanliness was spiritual duty, yet the people who actually removed waste, known later as manual scavengers, were ostracised from society. Their work kept cities livable, but it also placed them outside the boundaries of purity. It's a tragic paradox that echoes across nearly every civilization. The cleaner the city, the dirtier the job. As you stand in the middle of this imaginary timeline, surrounded by centuries of grime and gratitude that never arrived, one thing becomes clear. Civilization has always been a negotiation between beauty and filth. The temples, the palaces, the gardens, all of it depended on the quiet persistence of people who carried the waste away. Every golden empire produced equal parts glory and garbage, and someone had to take out the trash. You look down at your hands covered in imaginary soot and sludge, and you can't help but laugh. Humanity may have invented philosophy, astronomy, and literature, but we still can't figure out how to put the lid down properly. The story of progress isn't about the thinkers in marble halls, it's about the people who, day after day, kept the cities from becoming uninhabitable swamps. The air begins to settle, heavy with the scent of sewage and survival. Somewhere in the distance, a worker empties another bucket into the street. You realise that every ancient city was built on this hidden layer of labour, a foundation not of stone, but of endurance. And just as the sound of shovels fades, another noise begins to echo through history. The hiss of steam, the clang of metal, the first spark of the industrial age. Because once humans learned to burn coal, they didn't just make machines. They created an entirely new breed of dirty jobs, ones that didn't smell of waste but of smoke, poison and progress. The air thickens with smoke and soot as the age of industry creaks to life. The waste collectors have faded into the alleys of memory, but new hands are rising to build, burn, and break in the name of progress. Civilization may be cleaner above ground, but the work below it has become darker, louder, and somehow even filthier. Tonight, you're stepping into the forgotten world of the ancient metal workers, the miners, smelters, and foundry labourers who gave civilization its backbone while quietly inhaling its poison. You stand at the mouth of a mine carved into the hills of ancient Anatolia around 3000 BCE. The sun above is a hazy shimmer, but down here, light dies fast. You're armed with a bronze chisel, a leather satchel, and a sense of optimism that will not last long. These early copper mines were the lungs of civilization, though no one yet understood that lungs shouldn't actually fill with dust. The tunnels are narrow and stifling, barely large enough to crouch. The air is thick with the metallic tang of crushed rock, and the only sound is the steady rhythm of picks tapping against stone, the heartbeat of empire. Mining was one of humanity's earliest specialised professions, and also one of its most dangerous. Archaeologists studying the Timna Valley mines in modern Israel found evidence that workers, often enslaved or forced labourers, endured conditions that would make a modern coal miner weep with gratitude. Fires were set inside the tunnels to fracture the rock, and then cold water was poured over it to make it crack, a process known as fire setting. It worked beautifully, except for the part where it filled the air with choking fumes and scalding steam. The miners used stone hammers and bone chisels, scraping at the glowing rock with cloths wrapped around their faces. The result? Metal for tools, weapons and wealth. Also, lifelong respiratory damage. Progress has always had a cough. Once the copper ore was dragged out by the sackful, it was time for the smelters to get involved. You step into an open-air furnace pit where men are working shirtless under the desert sun. Clay bellows wheeze as workers pump air into the flames, the temperature soaring past 1,000 degrees. The metallic fumes shimmer, turning the air into something almost alive. You can smell the sulphur, taste the metal, feel the skin of your forearms tighten under the heat. Smelting wasn't glamorous. It was exhausting, smoky, and relentlessly hot. The word forge may sound noble, but in practice, it was a slow cook of sweat and toxic gas. The rewards, however, were immense. Once smelters learned to mix copper with tin, they created bronze, the miracle metal that launched the first true age of technology. Bronze was strong, malleable, and lethal enough to arm armies and carve monuments. It made tools sharper, weapons deadlier, and economies richer. The people producing it, though, didn't share in the glory. They were often enslaved captives or lower caste labourers, earning barely enough to feed themselves. Every polished bronze statue you've ever seen was born from the lungs of someone you've never heard of. Fast forward to ancient Rome again, where mining had evolved into an organised empire of exhaustion. The Romans built massive mining complexes in Spain, Britain, and the Balkans. Pliny the Elder described these operations as the worst form of slavery. At Rio Tinto in Spain, tens of thousands of enslaved workers toiled underground in what was essentially an early industrial death trap. Mercury was used to extract silver, and the vapour filled the air with deadly fumes. Skeletons found near these mines show deformities in the spine and lungs so corroded they look like crushed paper. And yet, that same mercury-silver process financed the empire's currency, temples, and military campaigns. Rome glittered because someone else suffocated. There's an irony here that never changes. The cleaner the civilization looked above ground, the dirtier it got below. Metal workers and miners were the heartbeat of empire, yet they lived short, brutal lives. The tools that built aqueducts and temples came from men who rarely saw the sky. Ancient texts often referred to them not as craftsmen, but as the blackened ones, a poetic understatement for people permanently stained by soot and smoke. Step now into ancient China, where iron smelting reached unprecedented levels of sophistication. By the Han Dynasty, the Chinese had invented blast furnaces that could produce tons of pig iron per day. It was revolutionary, efficient, and catastrophically unsafe. Workers shoveled ore and charcoal into furnaces taller than houses, sparks leaping out like fireworks of doom. Contemporary records mention workers dying from inhaling fire dust, what we now know as silica and carbon particulates. Those who survived often developed chronic pain from the intense labour, hauling molten iron with wooden ladles while standing barefoot on scorched earth. And yet this chaos built wonders. Iron farming tools transformed agriculture, iron nails built palaces, and iron armour shaped empires. One Hanara proverb summed it up neatly: "He who works the iron feeds the nation but is never fed first." The metal that advanced civilization was also the metal that burned its creators alive. Move west again, into medieval Europe, where the blacksmith ruled every village. You stand inside a small forge, the walls slick with soot, the air thick with coal smoke. The hammer strikes the anvil with a rhythm older than language itself. Sparks burst like fireflies each time metal meets metal. Blacksmiths were respected but lived on the edge of ruin. Their job was essential, making weapons, tools, horseshoes, hinges, yet every blow of the hammer chipped away at their health. The combination of smoke inhalation, burns, and heavy lifting made them physically impressive but medically doomed. One chronicler from the 13th century wrote that the smith's lungs are like old bellows, puffed and blackened beyond cure. Romantic in a fatalistic way, iron was both progress and punishment. The same fire that forged civilization also slowly destroyed its creators. Archaeologists have even found smithy remains with layers of ash and soot so dense that entire forges had to be abandoned because they became structurally unsound. Imagine working so long that your workshop literally turns into a toxic cave. And yet, humanity didn't stop. We invented stronger alloys, higher temperatures, and deadlier fumes. By the late medieval period, entire towns sprang up around smelting centres like Nuremberg and Liège, their rivers running red with rust. The smell of sulphur and hot metal hung in the air like a permanent cloud. People called it the scent of industry, though it was really the smell of civilization melting itself into existence. The deeper you go into history, the more obvious it becomes that metalworking wasn't just a trade. It was the backbone of survival. Every civilization that mastered it grew powerful, and every worker who practiced it paid the price. From the copper miners of Anatolia to the iron smelters of China, their stories blur together in a haze of heat and ambition. The flames start to fade in your mind, the clang of hammers softening into memory. But just as the air clears, another sound rises, the steady crackle of oil lamps and the murmured prayers of men preparing something even stranger. Because in the next chapter of civilization's dirty work, fire won't be used to forge metal. It'll be used to burn bodies, purify souls, and embalm gods. The dirtiest job of all is about to begin. The fires of the forges fade, and you find yourself surrounded by a different kind of heat. Not the glow of molten metal this time, but the dense, humid air of ancient cremation grounds. Civilization has always needed builders, miners, and smiths, but it also needed specialists in the business of decay. You're now among the corpse handlers, the undertakers, and the embalmers of antiquity, the people whose job description started where everyone else's ended. The work of death wasn't something anyone chose willingly. Across much of the ancient world, handling the dead was both necessary and taboo. In ancient Egypt, embalmers were considered essential to the soul's afterlife journey, yet they lived at the fringes of society, often near necropolises where no one wanted to visit unless they absolutely had to. The process itself was a grim choreography that could take up to 70 days. The body was washed, organs removed, and the cavity filled with linen, resin, and sawdust to keep its shape. Natron, a natural salt mixture, was used to dry the flesh. and after that the skin was coated in oils to create that eerie, leathery sheen that has somehow survived thousands of years. The embalmers knew anatomy long before anatomy was a science. They discovered that the brain could be removed through the nostrils using a hook, a method so grotesque yet effective that modern forensic experts have marvelled at its precision. They also learned that preserving the liver and lungs made the body last longer, though not necessarily smell better. The irony was that these workers were both sacred and unclean. They were priests of preservation, yet forbidden to join public life. One misstep in procedure could mean the wrath of the gods, or a lawsuit from the deceased's relatives. And yes, ancient Egyptians had legal complaints about botched mummifications. Civilization, it seems, invented customer service very early. Move eastward to the Ganges plains of India, where another group of workers performed their own ancient service to the dead. Cremation was a holy act, but it came with very earthly logistics. The pyres needed to burn for hours, sometimes days, and the wood supply was immense. In ancient Varanasi, wood traders, corpse washers, and pyre tenders formed a miniature economy. The men who tended these fires inhaled constant smoke, standing barefoot on ashes that were still warm from the last ceremony. Their skin darkened from soot, their lungs from inhalation. Yet they were indispensable. The ashes they created were believed to liberate souls from the cycle of rebirth. You could call it one of humanity's earliest recycling programs, though one that didn't come with much recognition. In China, burial took on an entirely different tone. During the Shang and Zhou dynasties, tomb building was a monumental enterprise. Workers dug massive pits and filled them with everything the dead might need in the afterlife. Weapons, vessels, chariots, and occasionally human sacrifices. Tomb attendants were often buried alive to serve their master in eternity. The teams that constructed these tombs did so under tight secrecy. In later dynasties, some were reportedly sealed inside the tomb after completion to prevent looting. Imagine finishing your shift only to find out the exit was no longer part of the plan. By the time of the Qin dynasty, the concept reached industrial scale. The terracotta army, nearly 8,000 clay soldiers, was crafted by teams of artisans who worked with deadly efficiency. They mixed clay, moulded faces, painted armour, and fired figures in massive kilns, all while breathing toxic fumes from lead-based paints. Archaeologists examining residue on the statues found traces of mercury, suggesting that even the decorative pigments were hazardous. In the process of building immortality for emperors, the builders themselves were quietly erased. Now step into ancient Rome, where the undertakers were known as libitinari, named after the goddess Libitina who governed funerals. These men were the Roman equivalent of morticians, gravediggers and sanitation workers combined. They handled bodies, organised cremations and maintained the necropolises outside city walls. Society depended on them but pretended not to see them. Roman law forbade burials inside city limits, so the libitinari worked along the dusty roads beyond the gates. They were paid well by the wealthy but despised by the rest. Some historians suggest that they wore specific tunics, so others could avoid touching them in public. The Roman approach to death was pragmatic but deeply unhygienic. Cremations were done in open-air pyres, often in large pits shared by multiple families. The smell was unforgettable, described by one ancient writer as a fog of fat and incense. The ashes were gathered, mixed with wine and placed in urns. Those who couldn't afford the service were dumped into communal graves called puticuli, vast trenches filled with bodies stacked like firewood. It was efficient, if not exactly comforting. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Mediterranean, the ancient Greeks were developing their own funeral economy. Professional mourners, usually women, were hired to wail over the dead. Their job was to make death look suitably tragic. The louder and more dramatic the crying, the more honourable the farewell. Some accounts from Athens mention mourners fainting, tearing their clothes, or smearing ashes across their faces for added authenticity. It was the world's first performance art of grief. Archaeologists have even found ceramic figurines depicting women frozen mid-sob, a kind of ancient Yelp review for your local funeral services. Jump forward to medieval Europe, where plague pits became the new normal. Gravediggers were suddenly among the most overworked and underpaid men on earth. During the Black Death, entire towns were buried by a handful of survivors. Chroniclers wrote of bodies piled like layers in a lasagna, though no one was in the mood for metaphors at the time. These workers handled corpses day and night, their hands raw from lime powder used to mask the stench. Many didn't live long enough to finish the job, yet their brutal efficiency prevented outbreaks from consuming even more lives. It's a grim reminder that civilization owes as much to shovels as it does to swords. Somewhere amid this global collage of deathwork, you notice a pattern. Every culture treated the dead with reverence, but never the people who managed them. The embalmers, burners and buriers were invisible, necessary ghosts among the living. Without them, disease would have ruled unchecked, cities would have rotted, and religion would have lost its theatre. The very act of disposing of a body was the first form of public health, performed without recognition or reward. You take a breath, or at least try to. The air still smells of ash and salt and old fire. The work of keeping civilization clean has always meant standing when no one else dared to. From the sweat of tanners to the lungs of miners, and now the smoke of the cremation grounds, progress is a polite word for human endurance. And as the smoke clears, something new glints in the air. Not firelight, but oil lamps flickering over vats of bubbling liquid. The scene shifts to the workshops of perfumers, soap boilers, and dye makers. They were the alchemists of cleanliness, though their ingredients were far from pleasant. Civilization might finally smell better, but it's about to discover that beauty too comes with a stench. The smell of smoke fades, but not the stench of work. Civilization might have figured out how to handle its dead, but now it had to deal with the living, or rather, the parts of the living that no one wanted to touch. You're stepping into the world of the ancient soap makers, perfumers, and dye workers, the people who tried to make humanity look and smell slightly less offensive while standing knee-deep in the very materials that made it unbearable in the first place. The irony is that the pursuit of beauty in the ancient world was one of the dirtiest industries imaginable. You begin in ancient Babylon, around 2800 BCE, where archaeologists have uncovered clay tablets describing one of the earliest known recipes for soap. It wasn't the lavender-scented bar you know today. It was a paste made from animal fat, water, and ash. The mixture worked well enough to remove dirt, but it also left behind an odour best described as wet goat in mourning. Babylonian soap was less about fragrance and more about functionality. Still, it was a start, and like most early inventions, it probably began as an accident. Someone cleaning a cooking pot near a fire noticed the grease mixed with ash could strip grime off skin. A eureka moment that must have smelled terrible. Fast forward to ancient Rome, where personal hygiene was a civic obsession. Public baths weren't just for washing, they were the social media of the empire. Men and women gathered to gossip, negotiate, and complain about politics while sitting in pools of water that were rarely changed. The job of keeping these baths running fell to a group of labourers who scrubbed, heated, and refilled them daily. To clean themselves, Romans used olive oil instead of soap, rubbing it into their skin and scraping it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. The oil trapped dirt and sweat, but also everything else: dust, hair, flakes of skin, and the occasional insect. The waste was then collected and often reused as lamp fuel. Yes, Roman baths ran on recycled body grease, civilization at its finest. The real horror show, however, lay in the production of fragrance. Ancient perfumers were less chemists and more endurance athletes of the olfactory system. In Egypt, perfumery was an art tied to religion, medicine, and cosmetics. Workers extracted oils from myrrh, cinnamon, and lotus blossoms using hot fat, but to stretch their profits, they mixed these expensive ingredients with less glamorous materials like animal musk, civet, and ambergris, the latter being a polite word for whale vomit. Collecting it was dangerous and revolting. sailors had to cut open the intestines of stranded whales to find the waxy lumps, which were then dried in the sun until their stench mellowed into something allegedly pleasant. Ancient Egyptian nobles would dab it on their wigs and clothing, blissfully unaware that their perfume had once been inside a whale's digestive system. You shift to Phoenicia around the 13th century BCE, where another stinking miracle was unfolding. The famed Tyrian purple dye, symbol of royalty, wealth and power, came from the glands of sea snails. Workers cracked open thousands of these mollusks, extracted a tiny drop of mucus from each, and left it to ferment in the sun. The smell could carry for miles. One ancient author wrote that the dye works reeked of the ocean and of death. The labourers worked barefoot, splattered in purple stains that wouldn't wash off for weeks, and inhaled fumes strong enough to make them dizzy. Yet this disgusting process created one of history's most coveted colours. The Roman Emperor Nero reportedly forbade anyone else from wearing it under penalty of death. Imagine dying over snail juice. Medieval Europe kept the tradition of stink-based beauty alive. Soap making became a booming trade in places like Marseille and Naples, but the ingredients hadn't improved much. Animal fat was still the base, mixed with lye made from wood ash or quicklime. Workers spent their days boiling vats of grease over open fires, breathing in caustic fumes that burned their lungs and eyes. Their skin cracked and peeled from constant exposure. Soap was luxury for the rich, not a hygiene standard for all. The average medieval peasant might have gone their entire life without seeing an actual bar of it. When plague struck, the poor burned rosemary or lavender in their homes to mask the odour, believing pleasant smells could ward off disease. In truth, it just made the miasma of rot slightly floral. The perfume industry of the Renaissance took this madness to a new level. With cities growing crowded and personal hygiene still an optional hobby, masking the smell of humanity became big business. Perfumers in Venice and Paris experimented with new ingredients, including civet extracted from the anal glands of small African mammals, and castoreum, an oily secretion taken from beavers. These workers spent their days scraping, drying, and distilling animal secretions into sweet-smelling oils. In some workshops, the stench was so overpowering that perfumers developed chronic nosebleeds, yet nobles drenched themselves in the results, convinced that smelling expensive was the same as being healthy. One French courtier was said to wear so much perfume that servants could follow his scent for an hour after he left a room. In India, the art of attar making flourished under the Mughal Empire. Craftsmen distilled rose petals, sandalwood and jasmine using copper stills, a process that could take days. But they also worked with less romantic materials. Musk was harvested from deer glands, which required killing the animal, and many attar bases included a mix of animal fat and fermented milk. Workers endured suffocating heat in tiny distilleries, sweating into the very products they were making. Attar was prized for its longevity, but no one asked why it lasted so long. Spoiler: fat is an excellent preservative. Even soap evolved into something worth sneering at. In 17th century England, soap boilers worked in conditions so foul that city ordinances restricted their operations to the outskirts. One contemporary described their workshops as hotter than hell and twice as wicked. They produced massive quantities of tallow soap, a sticky yellow mass that smelled faintly of candle wax and decay. The workers' clothes absorbed the stink permanently, and apprentices were nicknamed tallow boys, a title no one wanted on their resume. Yet by the 18th century, soap production had become one of the foundations of industrial chemistry. The work was toxic, but it laid the groundwork for the modern cleaning industry. What all of this reveals is that civilization's obsession with beauty, cleanliness, and luxury has always been propped up by a mountain of unpleasant labour. For every rose petal pressed into perfume, there was a vat of fat bubbling somewhere nearby. For every royal cloak dyed purple, there were hands cracked and bleeding from shellfish brine. Even today, traces of that legacy linger. Many perfumes still use synthetic versions of animal musk. Soap advertisements might promise freshness, but their roots are in the smouldering pits of ancient factories. You glance around this imaginary timeline, the air swirling with overlapping scents: ash, oil, rot, and roses. The workers behind these smells lived short, hard lives, their hands soaked in the ingredients of civilization's vanity. Beauty may have been skin deep, but filth ran in the bloodstream of progress. And as the last cloud of smoke fades, you hear something new. The echo of footsteps on stone, the clang of bronze armour, the barked orders of men preparing for battle. Civilization was about to discover a new kind of dirty work, one that mixed blood, mud, and strategy in equal measure. The next workers wouldn't toil in workshops or sewers, but on battlefields, building empires from the ground up, one wound at a time. The scent of perfume fades into the metallic tang of sweat and iron. Civilization has now dressed itself in armour, painted banners, and marching drums. You're no longer standing in a workshop or a bathhouse, but on the edge of a battlefield where thousands of soldiers prepare to make history the only way anyone ever has: messily. Tonight's subject belongs to those who lived in the shadow of war, not as heroes or generals, but as the people who cleaned up after them. The camp followers, armour polishers, battlefield surgeons and sanitation workers who kept armies functioning through an unending haze of mud, disease, and regret. Forget the noble knight charging into glory. The reality of ancient warfare was more closely related to public waste management than strategy. Ancient armies, from Mesopotamia to medieval France, were mobile cities of filth. Every campaign meant thousands of men eating, sweating, bleeding, and defecating in the same cramped space for months. Someone had to dig the latrines, carry the waste, boil the linens, and tend to the wounded. These jobs were essential and revolting in equal measure. Start with the camp followers, an army's invisible workforce. These were men and women who trailed soldiers into battle, performing every humiliating task required to keep them alive. They cooked, cleaned, and patched clothing while scavenging whatever scraps they could find. Historical accounts from Roman campaigns describe thousands of such workers trailing behind the legions, setting up makeshift kitchens and cleaning blood-soaked tunics with whatever liquid was nearby, including urine or vinegar. Vinegar disinfected wounds surprisingly well, though the person applying it rarely smelled victorious. The medieval period made this system worse. During the 100 Years' War, European armies left behind miles of garbage, rotting animal carcasses and half-buried bodies. Camp followers, mostly peasants desperate for pay, were forced to bury the dead to prevent outbreaks of disease. Burial work was hazardous. It often meant working knee-deep in mud mixed with decomposing flesh. Chroniclers from the 14th century mention that after battles, entire teams were hired specifically to collect severed limbs and burn them. The smell was described as sweet and foul together, an aroma that only a historian could admire. And then there were the armourers, the medieval equivalent of industrial mechanics. Maintaining a knight's armour wasn't glamorous. Each suit had to be scrubbed clean after every battle to prevent rust, and the best polish came from a mixture of sand, vinegar, and sometimes animal fat. The job required endless hours of grinding and scrubbing, often by apprentices working in dim forges filled with soot. The pay was better than nothing, but the fumes from metal polish caused chronic lung damage. One English record from 1420 refers to a man blackened by his trade and blind by 30. Armour may have gleamed on the battlefield, but someone's lungs always paid for that shine. As you move across the medieval landscape, another group emerges, the surgeons of war. Their tools were sharp, their knowledge minimal, and their sanitation non-existent. In an age when infection was barely understood, battlefield surgery was closer to carpentry. The earliest accounts of military medicine date back to ancient Egypt, where healers carried kits of bronze scalpels and linen bandages. They could set bones and stitch wounds, but antiseptics didn't exist. Greek physicians like Hippocrates emphasized cleanliness, but Roman surgeons still worked surrounded by flies. Amputation was often performed with a saw heated in a brazier, not for sterilisation but to cauterise the wound afterward. The patient rarely survived, but at least the tool stayed shiny. By the Middle Ages, battlefield medicine reached new levels of horror. Barber surgeons, yes, barbers, doubled as doctors for soldiers. Their tools were kept in leather rolls that looked disturbingly similar to shaving kits. They carried knives, saws and cups for bloodletting. To clean wounds, they poured boiling oil into them, believing it sealed out infection. The patient's screams were considered a good sign, proof that they were still alive. During the Crusades, chroniclers wrote that the smell of cauterized flesh was so common in field tents that soldiers could identify it from a distance. Not every dirty military job involved surgery or sanitation. Some were logistical nightmares that made modern supply chains look civilized. Imagine being a medieval army's water carrier. Your job was to fetch barrels of water from nearby rivers, refill camp vats, and keep soldiers hydrated, which would have been fine if rivers hadn't doubled as sewers. Dysentery spread faster than gossip, and historians estimate that for every soldier killed in battle during medieval campaigns, up to 10 died from disease. The worst outbreaks were usually traced to contaminated drinking water. Despite this, armies continued camping near rivers, and water carriers continued hauling liquid cholera from one tent to the next. Ancient China's armies had their own version of this system. During the Han and Tang dynasties, massive armies of hundreds of thousands required entire divisions of labourers to maintain hygiene. Workers dug latrine trenches, cooked rice for thousands, and carried waste out of camp to dump far from rivers. Some records mention the nightmen, who cleaned latrines under the moonlight, earning extra pay because no one else wanted to go near them. Their work prevented epidemics, though their lives were short and their smell unforgettable. Move back to Europe and picture the siege camps that surrounded medieval castles. These were cities of misery, where the worst jobs combined both danger and disgust. The soldiers who operated trebuchets spent days launching rotting animal carcasses and barrels of excrement over castle walls to spread disease among the defenders. The results were effective but appalling. In 1346, during the siege of Kaffa, Mongol forces catapulted plague-infected corpses into the city, an early act of biological warfare that may have helped spread the Black Death into Europe. Every empire eventually learns that the easiest way to win a battle is to make the enemy vomit first. And then there were the armour cleaners who doubled as corpse strippers after battles. Once the fighting ended, they moved from body to body, removing valuable metal, clothing and weapons. It was dangerous work, as wounded soldiers sometimes played dead to strike back at scavengers. Chroniclers mention entire crews of workers hired to remove gear from corpses before they decomposed. They carried large hooks to roll bodies over and wore rags soaked in vinegar over their faces to dull the stench. The pay was decent, but it came with no social standing. No one toasted the man who retrieved your cousin's helmet from a corpse pile. In the Ottoman Empire, a unique profession emerged known as the janissary cleaners. These men handled waste, washed barracks, and collected the dead after campaigns. They were disciplined and organised, following routines that kept armies healthy. Ottoman military hygiene was centuries ahead of its time, but it came at the cost of human endurance. Workers scrubbed floors with vinegar and sand until their hands bled. They buried excrement with lime and washed corpses before burial, a task considered both pious and revolting. The deeper you study ancient and medieval warfare, the clearer it becomes that victory depended less on bravery and more on sanitation. The great conquerors of history didn't win because they were smarter or stronger. They won because someone in their army was willing to dig trenches, haul waste and scrub armour in freezing rain. Without those unseen workers, disease would have wiped out entire legions before the first sword was drawn. You stand now at the edge of a medieval battlefield, the noise fading, the smell lingering. The banners are torn, the soldiers gone, and only the clean-up crews remain. Civilization glorifies the generals, but it survives because of the people willing to clean up the mess afterward. Progress has always required a few hands willing to get filthy. And as the echo of battle fades, a new sound rises from the horizon, the creak of wooden beams, the rhythmic thud of stone, and the chatter of builders hard at work. The next group of labourers won't fight wars or handle the dead. They'll build the monuments that convince the world civilization was beautiful, even if it smelled like sweat, smoke, and manure. The battlefield fades into quiet, and the sound that replaces it isn't glory or triumph but construction. Wooden scaffolds creak, hammers strike in uneven rhythm, and the air tastes of limestone dust and sweat. Civilization has finished fighting, and now it begins building. But as the marble temples and grand fortresses rise, what no one ever mentions is the small army of labourers beneath the surface, shoveling, hauling, and coughing their way through the foundations of empire. You've stepped into the lives of the ancient builders, the quarry workers, and the brick makers, the people who shaped civilization out of rock, mud, and misery. Monuments don't build themselves, and in the ancient world they were rarely built by volunteers. The pyramids of Egypt are the obvious example. Contrary to the old myth, they weren't made by slaves whipped by pharaohs, but by tens of thousands of labourers who were technically employed, though their definition of salary involved bread, beer, and constant back pain. Excavations at Giza have revealed entire workers' villages complete with bakeries, breweries, and medical stations. Each labourer consumed up to 4 litres of beer a day, not for pleasure but hydration, since Nile water wasn't exactly bottled quality. Their bones tell the story of the job. Many show signs of arthritis, crushed vertebrae, and broken limbs that healed poorly. Imagine hauling multi-ton limestone blocks up mud ramps under the desert sun, while fueled entirely by carbohydrates and dehydration. It was history's first great work site accident waiting to happen. The quarry workers themselves had it worse. The limestone for the pyramids came from quarries just east of the site, but granite had to be transported from Aswan, nearly 500 miles away. Workers cut blocks using copper chisels and wooden wedges soaked in water. As the wedges expanded, the rock split, and the workers then hauled the pieces by rope. Each block could weigh as much as a small elephant. Ancient graffiti found on the quarry walls reveals that workers had a sense of humour about their suffering. One team called themselves the Drunkards of Menkaure. Another labelled their work crew the Friends of Khufu, which given the circumstances probably meant the opposite. Travel north to Mesopotamia, where the first cities rose from mud rather than stone. Brick making was a full-time career and an occupational hazard. Workers mixed river clay with chopped straw, pressed it into moulds, and left the bricks to bake in the sun. The heat was unbearable, the mosquitoes worse, and the risk of collapsing under your own kiln surprisingly high. Archaeological evidence from Ur and Babylon shows entire neighbourhoods built on reused bricks stamped with royal inscriptions, which means kings were recycling propaganda as building material. Bricks might have been reusable, but the workers weren't. Many died from respiratory illnesses caused by inhaling clay dust all day. Still, their handiwork lasted millennia. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia stand today as accidental memorials to the people who built them and probably coughed through every minute of it. By the time ancient Greece rose to power, stonework had evolved into an art and a health hazard. Quarrymen in the hills of Pentelicon near Athens extracted marble used for the Parthenon. They worked from dawn to dusk with iron chisels and wooden mallets, climbing narrow ledges with no safety gear. The marble dust clung to their hair, their lungs, their food. Ancient texts mention that many workers went blind from constant exposure to reflective white surfaces under the Mediterranean sun. The stone they carved still glows in museums today, while their bones rest somewhere beneath layers of the same marble dust they once inhaled. The Romans industrialised construction like no one before them. Their aqueducts, roads and amphitheatres required a workforce so large that historians joke the empire's true strength was its ability to weaponise manual labour. Roman engineers used pozzolana, a volcanic ash that allowed concrete to set underwater, a miracle material that still baffles scientists today. The catch was that mixing it by hand, exposed workers to fine silica particles that shredded their lungs. The concrete mixers of ancient Rome were walking experiments in chronic disease, yet the results were spectacular. The Pantheon's dome, still intact 2,000 years later, is both an architectural masterpiece and a monument to occupational hazard. Then there were the tunnellers, the people who dug beneath cities and fortresses to lay foundations or, in wartime, to collapse enemy walls. Their job was brutal and claustrophobic. Ancient tunnellers worked by oil lamp in spaces barely large enough to crawl through, using picks to carve through rock while others shoveled the debris away. Roman mining operations used similar techniques to extract gold and silver. The fumes from torches combined with the lack of airflow created a poisonous mix of smoke and sulphur. Some mines in Spain operated continuously using slaves who never saw daylight. Pliny the Elder, who documented everything from volcanoes to vinegar, described miners as condemned to eternal night. He wasn't exaggerating. The Middle Ages brought little improvement. The great cathedrals of Europe, Notre Dame, Chartres, Cologne, were architectural marvels built by men who earned less than a stable boy. Stonemasons worked hundreds of feet in the air on scaffolds made of timber lashed with rope, wearing shoes without soles thick enough to grip. A misplaced step meant instant death, and yet the work continued. Some cathedrals took centuries to complete, which means generations of the same families laboured on them without ever seeing the final result. Imagine spending your entire life carving gargoyles for a building your grandchildren might finish. It's the definition of long-term employment with no benefits. The materials were deadly too. Medieval builders used quicklime as mortar, a substance so caustic it could burn through skin. Workers mixed it barefoot in pits, sometimes collapsing from the fumes. Chronic exposure caused blindness and lung failure. Yet quicklime was essential for binding stone. Builders even used it to disinfect plague houses centuries later. The same substance that held up cathedrals also helped sanitize death. Civilization truly has a talent for multitasking. Over in Asia, monumental architecture carried the same cost. The Great Wall of China, often romanticized as a feat of unity and defense, was also one of the deadliest construction projects in history. Built over centuries by soldiers, peasants, and prisoners, it stretched across mountains, deserts, and rivers. Workers used local materials, tamped earth, stone, even rice paste as mortar. The conditions were brutal. In the winter, frostbite killed thousands. In the summer, dehydration did. Historical records from the Qin dynasty mention that labourers were buried in the wall itself when they died, earning it the nickname the longest cemetery on earth. It's poetic until you remember it's literal. The builders of civilization weren't just stonecutters and masons. They were also the scaffold cleaners, the rope weavers, and the brick carriers. In medieval guilds, apprentices spent years learning to mix plaster or cut timber before they were allowed to carve anything decorative. Some specialised in stained glass, a process involving molten sand and lead oxide that produced beauty and brain damage in equal measure. The shimmering light of medieval cathedrals came at the price of hallucinations, tremors, and early death among glassmakers. A 12th century text even refers to them as men of shaking hands, a tragic understatement. Every brick laid, every arch raised, every polished dome came from hands that trembled, bled, and blistered. The shining legacies of empire built on layers of exhaustion. The grandeur of civilization has always depended on those who would never live long enough to see its completion. The marble pillars of Athens, the sandstone temples of India, the towering spires of Europe, all share a secret foundation made of dust, sweat, and human sacrifice without ceremony. You look up now, through the imagined haze of construction dust, and for a moment the sound changes again. It's quieter, rhythmic, almost soothing. Somewhere nearby, water drips, tools clink, and the faint scent of fermentation fills the air. Civilization is still being built, but this time the goal isn't architecture, it's appetite. The next workers you'll meet didn't carve stone or forge iron. They built empires of taste, tending vats, fires, and stomachs in kitchens and breweries where hygiene was optional and flavour was often an accident. The stone dust of ancient builders still hangs in the air as the scent of fermentation creeps in. Civilization has always built, but now it begins to feed itself, and feeding millions meant inventing jobs no one wanted but everyone depended on. You're stepping into the ancient kitchens, breweries and slaughter yards where humanity's appetite met its breaking point. It's a world of bubbling cauldrons, smoking ovens, and rivers of questionable liquid. History likes to talk about banquets and feasts, but the people who made them possible lived in a haze of blood, fire, and spoiled grain. Cooking for a civilization wasn't glamorous. In ancient Egypt, bakers worked beside open hearths that never went out. The heat was constant, the flour mixed with sweat and insects, and the air so thick with ash that workers often wrapped their faces in damp cloth just to breathe. Bread was the foundation of the Egyptian diet, and it was made in monumental quantities. Archaeologists have found bakery remains at pyramid sites with hundreds of conical ovens. These ancient bakers ground grain on stone slabs, a job so repetitive it left grooves in their knees and joints. Analysis of their skeletons shows degenerative wear patterns identical to modern miners. Every loaf they baked came at the cost of their cartilage. The breweries next door weren't much better. Egyptian beer was thick, cloudy, and tasted more like sour oatmeal than a crisp lager. It was made by fermenting partially baked loaves of bread in large vats of water. Workers stood waist-deep in these mixtures, stirring with paddles and occasionally with their arms. The yeast, wild and unpredictable, bubbled in the sun, drawing swarms of flies that hovered over every sip. Beer wasn't just a luxury, but a staple. Workers were often paid in daily beer rations, and even children drank it. Civilization was literally fueled by mild intoxication and microbial resilience. Move to ancient Rome, and you find the food industry reaching industrial scale. The city's population of over 1 million people needed constant supply, and that meant slaughterhouses. The Romans called them macella, bustling markets where butchers worked knee-deep in offal. Animal blood ran through channels carved into the stone floors, mixing with water from public fountains that tried and failed to wash it away. Butchers were essential tradesmen, yet their work was considered too impure for polite society. They worked outside city centres, surrounded by flies and feral dogs waiting for scraps. Roman law even designated certain hours for animal slaughter to keep the smell from overpowering the temples. The tools were brutal and effective. Iron cleavers, bone saws and sharpening stones filled every corner of the butcher's stalls. Ancient writers mentioned that butchers often suffered deep gashes that became infected, yet most continued working, wrapping their wounds in wool and salt. The blood was collected and sold to sausage makers or tanners, nothing wasted, nothing truly clean. In a world without refrigeration, meat was a race against time. If it didn't sell by sundown, it was soaked in vinegar and resold the next day as preserved. Archaeological analysis of Roman sewers shows high concentrations of bone fragments and fat, evidence that the discarded remains of animals ended up right back in the city's water supply. In medieval Europe, things somehow got worse. Food production became a public spectacle of survival. Imagine the open markets of Paris in the 13th century, where butchers, fishmongers, and poultry sellers shouted over one another while standing on floors slick with entrails. The smell of rotting meat mixed with the scent of fish left out since dawn. Records describe butchers dumping carcass waste into nearby rivers, which the same city used for drinking water. The Seine in summer was said to smell of meat and misery. To keep the rats away, cats were kept in the stalls, and sometimes eaten themselves when supplies ran low. Fishmongers occupied their own layer of olfactory horror. Before ice or proper storage, medieval fish sellers used salt to preserve their wares. But once the salt absorbed enough moisture, the fish reverted to its original odour. The Thames in London became a repository of unwanted seafood. Municipal inspectors, known as ale conners or fish tasters, were employed to judge whether food was safe to eat, often by smelling or tasting it directly. The mortality rate for that position was unsurprisingly high. One London coroner's record from 1361 describes a taster who fell grievously ill after sampling oysters of suspicious virtue. Ancient China developed a more organised, if equally stomach-turning food infrastructure. Imperial kitchens in the Han and Tang dynasties employed entire armies of cooks who worked around the clock to feed the emperor, his court, and the bureaucracy. Workers skinned animals, fermented sauces, and boiled rice in bronze cauldrons large enough to drown in. The famed fish sauce jiang was made by layering fish guts, salt, and rice in sealed jars for months until the mixture decomposed into liquid gold, or rather, liquid grey. The smell was so potent that kitchens were built downwind from palaces, yet the flavour became so prized it was traded across Asia. The workers who brewed it lived among barrels of fermenting intestines, a job that paid little but defined an empire's taste buds. Ancient India's cooks faced their own brand of torment. Temples employed thousands of kitchen workers to prepare daily offerings for the gods, which then fed the priests and devotees. The kitchens of Jagannath Temple in Puri, for instance, were vast complexes with hundreds of earthen ovens. Workers laboured barefoot, stirring enormous cauldrons of rice, lentils and ghee over wood fires that turned the air into a furnace. The floors were permanently coated in oil, and burns were a daily occurrence. Yet the food they produced was considered sacred. Touching it with the wrong hand, stepping too close with a sandal, or sneezing could get you dismissed instantly. The divine, it turns out, had high sanitation standards, even when the cooks did not. In medieval castles, kitchens were both marvels of engineering and nightmares of hygiene. The floors were covered in animal fat, the rafters blackened with soot, and the storage rooms filled with mould. Rats thrived among sacks of grain, occasionally falling into vats of ale and being ladled out only after someone noticed an extra flavour. Servants called spit boys or turnbroachers spent hours rotating massive metal spits over roaring fires. The heat was so intense that many developed burns or fainted mid-shift. One account from the Tudor period describes a boy who passed out into the fire, prompting the creation of the turn-spit dog, a small breed trained to run in a wheel that rotated the spit. Humanity, in its infinite creativity, outsourced its suffering to dogs. Even the sweet trades had a grim side. Medieval sugar refineries used boiling syrup that could easily scald workers to death. Sugar was considered a luxury medicine in early Europe, prescribed for ailments ranging from coughs to heartbreak. But refining it required clarifying raw sugarcane juice with lime and filtering it through cloth, a process that filled the air with choking fumes. Workers coughed sugar dust for years, and their teeth blackened long before the product reached royal tables. When sugar production expanded into the Arab world and later into Europe's colonies, the scale of human suffering increased exponentially. The taste of sweetness was built on blistered hands. Throughout all these centuries, the people who fed civilizations remained invisible. They were the ones who kneaded, stirred, salted, and roasted through every age, ensuring that kings ate feasts and peasants survived another day. Their work touched every sensory boundary of disgust: the blood of the butcher, the slime of the fishmonger, the stench of fermentation, the heat of the kitchen, and yet civilization judged them by their proximity to filth. They were essential but expendable, praised for abundance only when famine struck. The aroma of burnt meat and sour ale lingers in the air as you step away from the kitchens of history. The workers vanish back into the steam, their sweat now part of the recipe for civilization itself. And somewhere beyond the markets, you begin to hear a different sound. The rhythmic scrape of reeds, the splash of water, and the quiet patience of those who worked not with food or stone, but with the living fabric of the earth. The next workers built the arteries of empires, draining swamps, digging canals, and taming rivers that refused to obey. Civilization's next miracle would be built not above the ground, but beneath it, where mud and water became mankind's oldest adversaries. The smell of roasted meat and smoke fades into something wetter, heavier, and altogether less appetizing. Civilization has eaten its fill, and now it needs to irrigate, drain, and clean up after itself. The next layer of history belongs to the people who tamed rivers, dug canals, and turned swamps into farmland. You've now entered the soggy, mosquito-infested world of the ditch diggers, water carriers, and sewer cleaners who kept ancient cities from drowning in their own waste. These were the labourers who spent every day knee-deep in filth so everyone else could stay dry. Water was both a miracle and a menace. In Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, civilization itself depended on irrigation. Around 5000 BCE, early farmers built networks of canals to control the flooding that made the soil fertile. It was brilliant in theory, catastrophic in practice. Digging and maintaining these canals was endless work. Scribes from Sumer wrote about it constantly, mostly to complain. One tablet from Lagash records that canal labourers work through the night by torchlight, hauling mud in baskets made of reeds. They called it the work that never ends. Archaeologists found skeletal remains showing curved spines and knee deformities caused by years of repetitive digging. The irony of Mesopotamian civilization is that it rose out of irrigation, yet most of its workers died trying to keep the water in check. Egypt perfected the process but didn't make it cleaner. The Nile's annual flood was both blessing and chaos. Every year after the waters receded, workers had to dredge the canals and rebuild the mud embankments that had melted away. The pharaohs didn't just tax gold and grain, they taxed sweat. Entire villages were conscripted into cleaning ditches filled with rotting fish, algae, and dead crocodiles. Papyrus scrolls describe the job in the poetic understatement typical of bureaucrats. The stench is unbearable, but the gods reward those who persevere. The reward, of course, was more ditch cleaning next season. Egyptian canal workers were paid in bread and beer, and much like the pyramid builders, they were treated as replaceable parts in the machine of agriculture. The only lasting monument to their effort is the fertile Nile Delta itself, which exists because generations of men spent their lives shoveling sludge. The Indus Valley civilization went even further, turning sanitation into urban planning. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa had complex drainage systems that rivaled anything in Europe until the 19th century. The brick-lined drains ran beneath every street, connected to private bathing areas inside homes. It sounds sophisticated, and it was, but someone had to maintain it. Archaeological digs have revealed maintenance shafts clogged with sediment and broken pottery, proof that the ancient plumbers of the Indus spent much of their lives clearing blockages. Their tools were simple: reed rods, clay scoops, and occasionally their own hands. Civilization owes its earliest concept of hygiene to people who lived perpetually on the wrong side of clean. Move west to ancient Rome, where the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer, carried the waste of 1 million citizens into the Tiber River. It was an engineering marvel and a human nightmare. Workers known as Cloacinae Operarii maintained it by crawling through narrow tunnels filled with every form of organic horror imaginable. Roman engineers designed the system to be self-flushing during rainstorms, but in dry seasons it backed up catastrophically. The workers used long-handled rakes to dislodge blockages and occasionally had to dive in to remove larger debris. Ancient writers actually mention explosions caused by trapped methane igniting when workers brought torches inside. It was civilization's first documented workplace hazard, and unsurprisingly, the job was reserved for slaves and prisoners. The goddess Cloacina was worshipped as the divine protector of sewers. She must have had a dark sense of humour. The Romans extended their hydraulic empire across Europe, constructing aqueducts that stretched for miles. These channels carried fresh water to baths, fountains and villas, but maintaining them required a small army of workers. Algae, limestone buildup, and even small plants grew inside the conduits, reducing water flow. Workers climbed into narrow inspection shafts armed with scrapers and brushes, spending hours underground in near silence except for the drip of water. Inscriptions found near aqueduct maintenance tunnels sometimes include names carved into the walls, perhaps left by men who doubted they'd make it out alive. They were the unseen keepers of public luxury, risking suffocation so senators could enjoy clean baths. In medieval Europe, water management regressed spectacularly. The Roman aqueducts fell into ruin, and people went back to living ankle-deep in mud. Towns relied on wells and open ditches for drainage. Street gutters ran with everything from animal blood to chamber pot contents. It wasn't until the late Middle Ages that cities like Paris began hiring rakers to clean drains and maintain primitive sewers. These men worked at night, pushing carts through alleys while scraping waste from the gutters. Their tools were simple: wooden shovels, rags, and an iron stomach. Chroniclers from the 14th century describe them as blackened ghosts who vanished by dawn. The smell of medieval streets was so infamous that visitors from cleaner parts of the world wrote about it with fascination. One Persian traveller to 13th century London described it as a city where the earth itself appears to rot. Farther east, China's water engineers took a more organised approach. The Grand Canal, begun during the Sui dynasty and expanded under the Ming, became one of the largest infrastructure projects in history. Stretching over 1,000 miles, it connected the rice fields of the south with the imperial capital. Maintaining it was a constant nightmare. Silt build-up required dredging crews to work year-round. The job was deadly. Workers drowned, were crushed by collapsing banks, or died from infections after days spent waist-deep in stagnant water. The canal labourers formed entire floating communities, living on barges surrounded by the stench of their own work. Yet without them, China's grain supply would have collapsed. Every bowl of rice in the emperor's palace came at the cost of 100 blistered hands. By the early modern period, water management was global misery. In the Ottoman Empire, cistern cleaners descended into vast underground reservoirs to remove sludge. They worked by lamplight, shoveling mud and dead animals into baskets pulled up by ropes. Some cisterns were so large that echoes of their footsteps could last several seconds, giving rise to rumours of ghosts. In reality, the only spirits present were ammonia fumes strong enough to make men hallucinate. The Byzantine cisterns beneath Istanbul still smell faintly of decay, a lingering reminder of the workers who kept the city alive. Medieval armies also needed water management, and that meant another layer of filth. Soldiers on campaign often dug makeshift latrine trenches beside rivers, contaminating their own water supply within days. The job of digging new trenches fell to camp labourers, often punished criminals. These men were ironically responsible for preventing epidemics that wiped out entire armies. During the Crusades, chroniclers noted that disease claimed more lives than battle. Latrine diggers, in their grim way, were the unsung defenders of civilization's most basic necessity. Not honour, but hygiene. Every ancient empire learned the same truth. Water gave life, but it also created filth. Civilization's progress depended on those willing to stand knee-deep in the muck and keep it flowing. Their reward was anonymity and disease. They built the veins of cities, carried the weight of empires, and drowned quietly in history. The monuments we admire above ground exist because someone below was willing to shovel. As the sound of dripping water fades, another rhythm begins to rise. Not the scrape of shovels or the clatter of stone, but the shuffle of sandals and the low murmur of ritual. Civilization has mastered the elements, but it still fears the unseen. The next labourers you'll meet didn't build cities or feed armies. They served the gods directly, maintaining the sacred spaces that promised order, purity, and divine favour. And as you'll soon see, holiness in the ancient world was rarely clean. The air grows still, heavy with incense and something far less heavenly. Civilization's relationship with cleanliness has always been complicated, but its relationship with the divine has been downright filthy. You've arrived in the world of the temple workers, priestly attendants, and ritual cleaners who kept ancient religion running, quite literally scrubbing the sins of society from the floor. The monuments of faith may have glistened in sunlight, but the work behind them was closer to a full-time sanitation job wrapped in spiritual justification. Every great civilization had its sacred spaces, and every sacred space had someone on hands and knees keeping the gods' homes clean. In ancient Egypt, temple maintenance was a job that never ended. Priests shaved their entire bodies every few days to maintain ritual purity, but their assistants were the ones dealing with the unholy mess left behind by daily offerings. Each morning, temples received food, beer, and animal sacrifices meant to nourish the gods. The problem was that the gods never actually ate them. The food rotted quickly under the Egyptian sun, and someone had to haul it out before the entire place smelled like a fish market in a furnace. These temple workers scraped blood and fat off altars with bronze knives, washed stone floors with Nile water, and carried buckets of refuse out to the edge of the desert, where jackals waited like unpaid co-workers. Hieroglyphs don't mention these men by name, but the grease stains on the temple floors still tell their story. Farther east in Mesopotamia, temple duty was considered both an honour and a punishment. The ziggurats, towering step temples reaching toward the heavens, were not just places of worship but centres of economic life. Priests oversaw grain storage, tax collection and livestock sacrifice, which meant there was always a mess to clean. Animal entrails were burned as offerings, filling the air with a smell halfway between a barbecue and a battlefield. Workers carried away the remains to bury or dump in nearby rivers, an early form of ritual waste disposal that turned waterways into sacred cesspools. Cuneiform tablets from Uruk describe workers washing altars until the blood runs clear, a phrase that's poetic until you realise it's literal. The ancient Hebrews refined temple cleanliness into a precise science. In the Temple of Jerusalem, hundreds of priests and assistants managed a daily flood of sacrifices. Every morning the stone courtyard ran with the blood of sheep, goats and bulls. The priests wore linen garments and worked barefoot, their feet slick with holy gore. Drains carved into the floor funneled the blood into the Kidron Valley, where it soaked into the earth. The temple was the spiritual heart of Israel, but it probably smelled like a combination of iron, smoke and burnt hair. Religious texts speak often of purity, but the worker's job was closer to that of professional butchers maintaining divine sanitation. Travel to ancient India, and you find an entirely different relationship between holiness and hygiene. The temples of the subcontinent were living organisms, constantly fed with flowers, milk, butter, and incense. The gods had to be bathed, dressed, and fed several times a day, which meant entire teams of attendants working in shifts. They prepared offerings, cleaned altars, and collected the leftovers, known as prasada, to distribute to worshippers. But the job wasn't always serene. Temple elephants had to be washed, sacred cows fed, and occasionally animals sacrificed in regional traditions. Workers swept courtyards covered in petals and dung, polished bronze idols with oil, and waded through ankle-deep puddles of spilled milk and melted ghee. It was equal parts devotion and janitorial work. Some temples even employed water bearers, who spent their lives carrying river water in clay pots for ritual baths. Their shoulders deformed from the weight long before the gods noticed. China's religious workers faced a similar mix of reverence and grime. Taoist temples required daily cleansing rituals involving smoke, salt, and water. Monks and acolytes cleaned not just the physical temple but also the symbolic impurities brought by worshippers. Incense ash piled high around the altars, animal sacrifices left behind bones, and constant offerings of rice and fruit attracted vermin. To ward off corruption, workers burned aromatic herbs, though the smell of mould and mouse droppings usually overpowered it. The labour was sacred, but it was also exhausting. Ancient records mention monks suffering from chronic respiratory problems due to smoke inhalation. Holiness apparently came with asthma. In the Greco-Roman world, religion was just as messy, though the architecture tried to disguise it. Temples gleamed with marble facades and gold statues, but the sacrifices inside were brutal affairs. The priestly assistants, called neokoroi in Greece or victimari in Rome, were the true workforce of the gods. They tied down animals, slit their throats, and caught the blood in bowls to pour onto altars. Once the ritual was done, they skinned and butchered the carcasses for public feasts. These were sacred barbecues with a sanitation problem. Ancient writer Lucian complained that the smell of burnt offerings could make an entire city reek for days. To make matters worse, Roman priests wore elaborate robes that were nearly impossible to clean, so by the end of each festival they looked like exhausted butchers cosplaying as politicians. The Aztecs, meanwhile, took divine service to another level entirely. Their temples were centres of cosmic balance maintained through human sacrifice. The priests who carried out these rituals lived under conditions that combined devotion, gore, and sensory overload. They fasted for days, painted themselves with soot, and used obsidian blades to open chests and extract hearts. Afterward, the bodies were rolled down temple steps, and the lower attendants, the true unsung workers, had to gather, clean, and prepare them for disposal. Some were buried, some dismembered for ritual feasts, and some left for scavengers. The smell of blood and smoke around Tenochtitlan's great temple was said to cling to the air for miles. Even Spanish conquerors, no strangers to violence, described it as the stench of eternity. In medieval Europe, monastery work offered its own form of divine discomfort. Monks and lay brothers lived by the rule of ora et labora, prayer and labour, which sounded noble until you realised the labour involved cleaning latrines and scrubbing cloisters. Monasteries were surprisingly dirty places. The kitchens stank of fish, the dormitories of unwashed robes, and the gardens of manure used as fertiliser. Every monastery had a designated worker known as the necessarian, who maintained the communal latrine, often located over a running stream. His job was to make sure waste didn't clog the flow, which meant climbing underneath to clear blockages by hand. Some orders considered this an act of humility, but no amount of prayer made it smell like enlightenment. Even the cathedrals that dominated Europe's skylines had their share of unpleasant holy work. Candles dripped wax onto the stone floors, pigeons nested in the rafters, and incense blackened the ceilings. Cleaning crews, often poor parish labourers, spent their days scraping soot from walls and sweeping up debris after services. During winter, the smell of damp clothing, smoke, and unwashed bodies filled the nave. Religion might have promised salvation, but its daily maintenance required strong lungs and stronger stomachs. No matter where you look, the pattern holds. The closer people got to the divine, the dirtier their work became. The world's great temples, shrines, and sanctuaries functioned because of workers willing to scrub altars, gut animals, and shovel offerings before they spoiled. Their labour created the illusion of holiness that still captivates us today. Behind every incense cloud and shining idol stood a small army of people with rags, knives, and a tolerance for smells that defied belief. The sacred air begins to clear, and through the haze another sound begins to rise, the steady hum of the marketplace. Civilization may have worshipped gods, but it survived on trade. The next group of workers didn't pray for prosperity. They measured it, minted it, and sometimes swallowed it by accident. The dirtiest job in the next chapter wasn't in a temple or a sewer. It was in the mint, where men turned raw metal into the currency of empires while slowly poisoning themselves in the process. The echoes of chanting fade into the metallic clang of hammers. The air is thicker now, full of dust, heat, and a faint sweetness that turns your stomach. Civilization has prayed, built, and eaten its fill, but now it needs to count. You're stepping into the ancient world's most toxic business, the mints, mines, and workshops where money itself was made. The glittering coins and ornaments that fueled empires began their lives in places that could kill you by the end of your shift. To understand the beauty of ancient wealth, you have to stand inside the filth that created it. The birth of money wasn't a clean one. Around 600 BCE in Lydia, modern-day Turkey, the first coins were struck from a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver called electrum. The process required smelting ore at temperatures high enough to melt stone. Workers fanned the flames with leather bellows until their arms cramped, while toxic fumes filled the air. Early metallurgy didn't have ventilation or masks, just strong lungs and weak lifespans. Archaeologists studying ancient Lydian furnaces found layers of condensed mercury and lead on the floor, a glittering film of poison. The coins that came out of those forges were beautiful, stamped with lions and symbols of power. The men who made them coughed themselves to death before they could spend one. As coinage spread, so did the misery. Ancient Greece and Rome industrialized minting with mechanical precision. Coins were struck by hand with iron dies, requiring thousands of blows per day. Workers known as cellatores heated metal blanks over open fires and then hammered them between engraved moulds. It was monotonous, deafening, and dangerous. The constant impact shattered bones and left hands permanently swollen. Roman coins might have displayed the faces of emperors, but the fingerprints of the mint workers were sometimes pressed into their surfaces, still visible under microscopes today. Small, unintentional memorials to lives lived in fumes and fire. Mining the raw materials was far worse. In Spain, the Roman Empire operated massive silver mines at places like Rio Tinto. Tens of thousands of enslaved labourers worked underground in conditions so deadly that ancient writers called them death pits. The miners used iron chisels to break the rock and carried the ore out in baskets. To extract the silver, they used a process called cupellation, which involved heating the ore with lead until the lead absorbed impurities. Then the lead was evaporated in open furnaces, filling the air with toxic vapour. Modern scientists studying bone fragments from Roman mining regions have found lead levels hundreds of times higher than normal. The empire was literally built on lead poisoning. The same metal found its way into Roman plumbing, cookware, and even wine. Wealthy citizens drank from lead goblets, believing it enhanced the flavour. It did, in a way, by killing taste buds and brain cells. The Latin word for lead, plumbum, gives us plumbing and plumber, a job that in Rome meant breathing toxic fumes while crawling through dark tunnels. The Romans may have built aqueducts and baths, but their water system was a slow-motion neurological disaster. Historians still debate whether lead poisoning contributed to the empire's decline, but there's no doubt it made for a population with headaches, tremors, and wildly erratic emperors. Meanwhile, in ancient China, metal workers faced their own deadly crafts. The Chinese were among the first to refine mercury for use in gilding, medicine, and alchemy. Miners extracted cinnabar, a bright red ore that glowed like powdered fire, unaware it contained lethal mercury sulfide. They heated it in clay retorts to extract pure mercury, which pooled like liquid silver at the bottom. The fumes alone could kill. Ancient texts describe workers suffering fever of the spirit and trembling hands, classic signs of mercury poisoning. Despite this, mercury was used in everything from cosmetics to medicine. The first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, famously ingested mercury pills in search of immortality. He achieved eternal fame, though not quite the kind he intended. Goldsmiths and silversmiths across the world endured similar fates. In ancient Egypt, gold workers used blowpipes to heat metal, inhaling soot and fumes in confined workshops. Their eyes and lungs burned, but their labour fueled the myth of divine gold, the flesh of the gods. Egyptian tombs glowed with the products of their suffering, from delicate jewellery to funerary masks. The gold leaf that covered royal coffins was beaten so thin it could float on air, requiring hours of hammering by hand. Workers described their ears ringing from the constant rhythm, a metallic heartbeat that followed them home at night. The medieval period added chemistry to the chaos. Alchemists and metal refiners experimented with new methods of extraction and alloying, many involving mercury, arsenic, and sulphur. Guild records from the 13th century Venice mention gilders of the quicksilver, men who applied thin layers of gold to bronze statues by brushing them with a mercury mixture and heating them until the mercury evaporated. The result was stunning, gleaming statues that shimmered like solid gold. The price was madness. Chronic exposure to mercury caused hallucinations, trembling and loss of teeth. By 40, most gilders looked twice their age and could barely hold a brush, yet their work decorated palaces, cathedrals and coins across Europe. In the Islamic world, metalworkers reached remarkable levels of skill. Damascus steel, the legendary alloy used in swords, required secret processes of heating and quenching that produced blades with rippling patterns and unmatched sharpness. The forges that made it burned charcoal day and night, filling entire districts with black smoke. The air was so thick that smiths wrapped their faces in wet cloth. The trade was respected but physically punishing. Apprentices began young, hammering for hours in heat that could blister skin in minutes. The romantic image of the master swordsmith hides a lifetime of burns, lung disease and ruined joints. The craftsmanship was unmatched, but it came with a short lifespan and long suffering. Coins themselves were toxic objects long before circulation. To prevent counterfeiting, many mints mixed metals, copper, tin, zinc, without consistent ratios. Handling coins all day left traces of lead and arsenic on the skin. Workers who counted and polished them developed what modern doctors would call chronic heavy metal exposure. Their fingertips turned grey, and their nails grew brittle. Ironically, the more coins they handled, the less likely they were to live long enough to spend them. Across the world, money's production was a slow act of self-poisoning. The ancient Persians mined turquoise and lapis lazuli for trade, grinding the stones into dust for polishing. The inhaled particles caused silicosis, a disease that scarred lungs beyond repair. In Renaissance Florence, gold leaf makers worked in cramped attics, beating metal so thin it was translucent. The rhythmic thuds echoed through the streets, a sound locals called the pulse of gold. The pulse stopped often, usually when the worker collapsed from exhaustion or mercury exposure. Even paper money came at a cost. When China introduced the world's first banknotes during the Tang dynasty, workers at the Imperial Printing Office handled inks made from lead and soot. They mixed pigments with animal glue, stirring vats by hand. The soot clung to their skin, staining it black. Some workers inhaled so much particulate matter that their lungs looked like charcoal briquettes when excavated centuries later. The invention of currency didn't make civilization cleaner. It just made the dirt smaller and more profitable. You can almost feel the grit of coins between your fingers, the faint metallic taste of history's economy. Wealth, at every point in time, came with invisible fingerprints of miners, smelters, and smiths who paid in breath what kings spent in luxury. The gleam of civilization's currency is nothing but polished suffering condensed into metal. And as the last hammer strike fades, another rhythm rises, the slow rustle of parchment, the scratch of ink, and the murmur of men hunched over desks. Civilization might have minted its money, but now it needed to record it. The next workers built empires of knowledge, copying, counting, and documenting everything by hand. Yet even that seemingly noble labour came with its own decay, its own quiet misery, hidden beneath the smell of ink and parchment. And that, my friends, is another cheerful stroll through the grime-soaked miracle we call civilization. Humanity has built temples, armies, and empires, mostly by accident and almost always while standing in something unsanitary. If you enjoyed tonight's relaxing descent into historical misery, make sure to check out the other videos on this channel. There's plenty more questionable hygiene and centuries-old suffering where that came from. And I'd love to know, what should we dig into next? Maybe medieval dentistry, Roman bathwater etiquette, or the surprisingly violent history of early deodorant? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. Your idea might just become the next soothing tale of pain, progress, and poor career choices. Now get some rest. You've earned it. Tomorrow's another beautiful day to appreciate indoor plumbing.